Hey everybody, how's it going? Steve here. Today is another day in America. And that means, of course, that we need to talk yet again about the Nintendo Switch 2 and what is going on with tariffs. New reporting out of gamesindustry.biz implies that the Switch 2 may yet be more expensive than anybody was wanting it to be, with China's 145% tariff still taking effect despite the fact that President Trump announced exclusions for certain electronics. That exclusion was just for smartphones, semiconductors, and laptops. We reported on that earlier, but new fears have cropped up thanks to a report from Nikkei Asia, which basically indicates that Nintendo's specific supply chain is still saying that 145% tariffs will affect the console. There is truth to that, but it's not as dire as some may think. We'll dive into that in a bit. Nintendo also isn't the only company that is grappling with price increases. Sony just this week announced that the PlayStation 5 will go up about 10% in Europe and New Zealand, while the disc drive comes down and the PS5 Pro remains at its current price. No price increase, weirdly enough, for the United States just yet, though I suspect that will change unless Sony is also working on some alternative manufacturing methods. And speaking of manufacturing, we have to talk about what I believe the real situation for the Nintendo Switch 2 will be here in the States. I've stated this previously. I think it's going to remain flat at $449.99. And the reason being for that is that Nintendo wisely shifted much of their Switch 2 production, not all, not even most, but much, over to Vietnam. Their partner Hoshiden, who manufactures the Switch 2, also had facilities there. They moved some production over there to offset the potential impact of tariffs, which is proving to have been a wise decision, as China has a 145% tariff currently as of the publication of this video, while Vietnam only has the global 10% that's been levied literally against everyone else, meaning that Nintendo could quite possibly just kind of eat that 10% increase in cost without passing it along to us. But even if they didn't, it means that the Switch 2 would go up most likely by $25, $30, maybe $50. I believe that Nintendo is just going to stick with the announced price to not confuse messaging further. Obviously, there's still a lot in the air. We don't know the actual pre-order date for the Switch 2 here in the US. Switch 2 pre-orders have gone off in other parts of the world already, so we're waiting to hear. Switch 2 pre-orders were originally reported as starting on May 8th, but that was just misinformation. It turned out that several publications didn't know that Nintendo was always going to run Switch 2 pre-orders here in the US in the My Nintendo store on May 8th, and someone read it somewhere and it became a game of telephone and everybody started repeating it. That's always been the date for My Nintendo. We don't know when retail pre-orders will happen even as of right now. So there will be more to come, probably another news update as soon as Nintendo reveals when they're going to start doing pre-orders for Switch 2 here in North America at retail. I always plan on pre-ordering mine from My Nintendo anyway on May 8th, so that date, as far as I know, is still in stone. It's on Nintendo's website as being the date that they will accept pre-orders. I kind of feel like maybe retail will just go live the same day because it gives Nintendo a competitive, it takes away the competitive advantage that they had given to retailers. So maybe that's just what's going to happen now. We'll all find out together. But let's talk about manufacturing, Vietnam, and how that factors into tariffs, because we actually do have solid data on this. This comes from Bloomberg. They actually reported this 4 days ago, a little bit after I did my last Switch 2 tariff video, and it has actual concrete information and numbers that I think we'll all appreciate. But basically, I posited at the time that Nintendo was going to move Switch 2 production for the US market almost entirely to Vietnam. And that seems to be the case because Bloomberg actually captured the data from customs about what has been going from Nintendo's facilities in Vietnam to the United States versus other countries in the world, because customs data is actually public information that anyone can look up if you know where to look. And basically from all of 2024, it was a pretty good split between the United States and the rest of the world. But beginning in January 2025, production shifted almost entirely to being exported to the United States. That means that everything Nintendo's producing in Vietnam has started to ship almost completely to the US. Yeah, in fact, in January of 2025, about 383,000 units shipped out from Vietnam entirely to the United States. And in February, that number dramatically increased to 725,000 units, leaving Vietnam for American shores, with just 60,000 units going to other parts of the world. That's as far as the data we have currently goes, but it stands to reason that Nintendo dramatically increased shipments from that Vietnamese facility to the United States to avoid tariffs. And I imagine that this is going to be exactly what we continue to see as the year wears on. As we get closer to the June 5th release date of the Switch, which as of now is still happening and is still in place, I think that's what we're going to see. Nintendo is going to get as many units from Vietnam as they can to avoid the much higher tariff that Trump has placed on China. But what this means for the United States and for our consumer base is that Switch 2 units might be more constrained than we would like them to be. It might mean that you're going to have trouble finding a Switch 2 on store shelves because there might just not be enough of them to get in if you want to preserve that $449 price point. I think it's in Nintendo's best interest to preserve the announced price of the Switch 2 without a hike before release. I think they're probably weighing out if they can meet supply or meet demand with supply while doing that. And that remains to be seen. We don't know what demand for the Switch 2 is going to be like. We don't know how many units it's going to sell, what's going to happen there, but it stands to reason that demand for the Switch 2 is going to be sky high. People love the current iteration of the Switch. It's one of the best-selling consoles of all time, and so you're going to want to produce and import a lot of them to meet that demand as quickly as you can. Obviously, with just 1 out of 3 Switch 2s being made in the Vietnamese facility, that means 66% of the supply would be subject to tariffs if they started bringing in units from China. I kind of expect Nintendo not to do that here because people will likely not want to pay more than Nintendo has already announced for the Switch 2. It's already a pretty high-priced console, and going higher is going to damage the public perception of it. So we'll have to see what happens here, but it seems likely that Nintendo is going to use their Vietnamese production facilities to supply the US as much as they can. If they deem for whatever reason that is not enough to sate demand here in the US, we're either going to go through one of 2 scenarios, a shortage or a price hike. And I'm leaning more towards shortage because it was recently rumored today, in fact, that GameStop stores will be receiving about 100 or fewer Switch 2 units per store. If you live in a small town like me, that's kind of routine. My GameStops don't get very many of any console when they come out. It's pretty hard to get. In fact, when the PS5 Pro came out, I was not able to get one at my local GameStop because they only got about 10. But if you live in a place like LA, Atlanta, New York, Chicago, big metropolitan hubs, this is going to be far fewer than your store is likely to get. At least that's how I understand the situation. And that points to supply constraints. It points to the idea that Nintendo can't really get enough of these into store owners' hands. And it's likely because they're having to send over, what they have in Vietnam. 1 out of every 3 Switch consoles produced. That may seem like a lot considering there are 3 major territories between the US, Japan, and Europe. However, the US is disproportionately consumes video games. The biggest video game market in the world is right here in the US, and we buy a lot more of everything because there is a lot more of us, I assume. But it'll be interesting to see what happens here. Obviously, supply constraints are no stranger to Nintendo or Sony or anybody that makes consoles. The Wii in 2007 obviously faced similar issues where it was off shelves for months after it came out. People still got by, it still sold extremely well, and was a very well-respected console, rightfully so. So I'm not super worried about this. I don't think we're going to be seeing a 145% increase in price for the Switch 2 because I think that the data points to Nintendo already importing many consoles from Vietnam, and I think that they may just focus their efforts on ramping up their production there, making more consoles faster in Vietnam so that they can avoid the kind of ongoing trade war between the US and China, and then use those Chinese produced units to supply Japan, the UK, everywhere else that also has demand for the console. So we'll see what happens here, but I want to hear from you. Do you think that Nintendo is going to solely rely on Vietnamese-produced Switch 2 units, or do you think that they're still going to import some from China and possibly increase the price to kind of balance out the tariffs between the Chinese-produced units and the Vietnamese-produced units? I don't know what the solution is here. I think that they're probably just going to, we're just going to experience a squeeze for a while Nintendo increases production in Vietnam and gets more production lines up and running for the console. It's easier to add production lines to a facility that already does all the things they need to do than it is to, say, come to the States and build a whole new factory, which would take forever. But that's going to do it for us today. Stay tuned to GVG for everything on the Switch 2 updates as they happen, and we'll be the first to let you know when American pre-orders open. If you want to support us, you can get involved over at patreon.com/gvgaming to find out how. And until then, we'll see you next time. Bye.